It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
Is the coalition over? Is the agreement with the SNP over?
In Scotland, the power-sharing deal between the SNP and the Greens has collapsed.
We need to speak to the country with one voice, our voice.
The First Minister has decided, I'm sorry to say, to capitulate to the most reactionary, backward-looking forces within the SNP.
Labour wants to renationalise the railways. What will that mean for passengers?
Labour will sweep away the broken model and bring private operators into public ownership as their contracts expire.
And this head teacher is bringing in a 12-hour school day. We'll ask him why. Joining me to discuss all that, Conservative MP Kieran Mullen, Labour MP Sam Tarry, Lib Dem MP Wendy Chamberlain and Kate Andrews, economics editor of The Spectator. This is Politics Live. Yes, let's start with the dramatic news that the power-sharing deal known as the Butte House Agreement between the SNP and the Greens in Scotland, it's over, terminated by the First Minister, to use his words, Humza Yousaf, this morning as the Green co-leaders were summoned to meet him ahead of a press conference that he gave not very long ago, Humza Yousaf. Let's hear a little bit more of what he had to say.
Was intended to provide stability to the Scottish Government, and it has made possible a number of achievements, but it has served its purpose. It's no longer guaranteeing a stable arrangement in Parliament. The events of recent days have made that clear, and therefore, after careful consideration, I believe that going forward, it is in the best interests of the people of Scotland to pursue a different arrangement. That is why, following a discussion with my Cabinet this morning, I have formally notified Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater that I am terminating the Butte House Agreement with immediate effect.
Well, just before the programme, I spoke to one of the co-leaders, Lorna Slater, from the Green Party, and started by asking her what happened.
The First Minister asked Patrick Harvie and myself to come along to Butte House for a conversation, at which the First Minister told us of his decision to end the Butte House Agreement, which is the cooperation agreement that has been in place between the Scottish Greens and the Scottish Government for the last 2.5 years.
And this was his decision?
This was his decision. And I think that he has caved into the right wing of his party, to some of the most regressive, politics in Scotland, and undone our progressive cooperation agreement. We were doing something new and different. Parties cooperating together, investing in nature, working for better living wages for the people of Scotland, and the First Minister has chosen to end that agreement.
Right. Emotive language, caved in, moved to the right. What's your evidence for that?
The evidence for that is the people in the media who are celebrating the end of the cooperation agreement. Some of the most reactionary right-wing voices, the Conservatives, will be delighted. I am sad for the young people of Scotland, for future generations of Scotland. We had a vision working together of a greener, better future. We were enacting that vision. We were putting things into place: free bus travel for young people, ban on incineration, a freeze on rent during the cost of living crisis. And now we are looking at not being able to deliver those things. Of course, the Scottish Greens will continue to push, but we're the last progressive voices standing.
But Lorna, you can understand why the SNP and why the First Minister weren't going to hang around while you prevaricated in terms of whether you were going to stay as partners in government or not. You were asking them to wait for 4 weeks while you waited to have an emergency meeting with your own party.
The Scottish Green Party is a grassroots democratic party, and it is right and good that we have that conversation and debate. We encourage debate with our members. We're member-led, and our members are enthusiastic volunteers from all over the country. They need the time to understand to understand the situation, to have that enthusiastic debate. Now, I know that the members were looking forward to that. I was looking forward to that. And I am confident that the members would have continued to support the agreement. And certainly Patrick Harvey and I, were willing to place our political careers on the line.
Right, but you were expecting the SNP, you were expecting the government and the SNP just to wait for all of that to unfold. You were part of the government that scrapped these climate change targets because they were unachievable.
The First Minister was very clear to myself and Patrick Harvey in Butte House this morning that his decision to end the agreement was because of pressures on him from the right wing, from his party. We were confident, and I remain confident that our party supports progressive politics and Scottish Greens in government. But let's talk about those climate targets. That it was made clear by the Climate Change Committee that Scotland could not meet those 2030 targets. Now that's due to decades of inaction. Most of that time with the SNP in government. With the Greens in government, we were starting to change that directory. The proposals last week on things like demand management for roads, looking at aviation tax charges, those kind of policies would have started to change that trajectory to get Scotland back on track. And those kind of changes were happening with Scottish Greens in government. Now, it looks like the Scottish Government will abandon its climate ambitions altogether because without Scottish Greens in the room, everything will get watered down and delayed.
Right. It was a historic moment when you entered into a power-sharing agreement with the SNP in government. Where does it leave your party now you've been effectively booted out?
The Scottish Greens continue to be the progressive voice for Scottish independence. We are the only party who prioritises climate and nature. And I suspect this will leave us with a strong intake of SNP members who no longer see their party as a voice for progressive values in Scotland. Right. So I expect our party will have a membership surge, and we will continue to push to be that voice for people and for planet.
Well, that was Lorna Slater talking to me a little earlier. Now, we did ask the Scottish Government for an interview, obviously, but no one was available. And I should say that the First Minister, Humza Yousaf, has said that they will govern with a minority administration and not for the first time. It is partly how the Scottish Government and how the system works. Let me get reaction from the panel here. Conscious, obviously, the SNP aren't here. But what did you make of what's happened, Kate? Let's start with you.
It's obviously destabilising. It's not ideal for the First Minister, but I don't think he had much of a choice. The idea that there would essentially be a referendum on his government with 8% of the vote in the last election, the Greens caucus, the Greens support, wasn't a realistic outcome for the SNP, but it is destabilising, and the winner's the Labour Party. Of course it is, right? This is exactly what the Labour Party wants to. I appreciate the Greens are saying the Conservatives are celebrating, but in the run-up to a general election, it's good news for Labour.
Do you agree?
It looks pretty chaotic, doesn't it? I mean, look, I know Humza, I've known him for many years. He's going to really struggle now to get his agenda through. And I think this is in the context, obviously, in recent weeks of the SNP chief executive being arrested for embezzlement. And on top of that, obviously, what many people regard as one of the most formidable politicians in modern British politics, Nicola Sturgeon, being arrested. I think the SNP are going to collapse at the next election. And this is just another crack appearing in the ice as they start to go under.
You heard there Lorna Slater saying Conservatives in the media in Scotland, in the right of the SNP, are celebrating. Are you celebrating the collapse of this power-sharing deal?
Well, I think I'm very sceptical about some of the stuff that's been used to spin it. I'm not so sure that actually the SNP wouldn't want to deliver all these policies anyway, and this is actually what they wanted to sign up to. It's convenient to have the Greens to blame them for this stuff. And I think now that it's coming home to roost, things like the net zero target, how damaging these policies are, I think it's convenient for them to now turn back, perhaps pivot away from them and say, well, actually, this was all the Greens pushing us into this. I'll be interested to see whether actually, when it comes to passing stuff in the legislature, whether the Greens will still be used to get stuff through actually that deep down the SNP still want. These kind of economic policies that are really damaging, particularly to their North Sea oil and gas industry, which is so important in Scotland. Let's wait and see what they actually do in the real world when it comes to this agreement. They're spinning it both to their interests at the minute.
What do you make of it, Wendy?
It sounds to me that this divorce is two parties that are now tearing themselves apart. And I think you were absolutely right to question Lorna Slater, because it did look like the Green tail was wagging the dog by expecting Humza Yousaf to wait while they were deciding what to do in relation to the Butte House Agreement. So Lorna's wrong to say that the Greens were totally behind it. It's quite clear that they weren't. They wouldn't be calling a vote in the first instance. And I think it's just very interesting now. I think Kieran's right to say that potentially how do the Scottish Government now get legislation through on those climate change targets? There still needs to be a legislative change to drop those targets. Are the Greens actually, now that they are no longer in government, going to vote against the dropping of those targets? I think the Scottish Government could find themselves in difficulty quite quickly. And I'll tell you, as obviously the Scottish MP that's here, knocking on doors in Scotland, there is no love for either the SNP or the Greens. I think the SNP are facing a very difficult election. And if the stories are true, it seems that Stephen Flynn was part of Humza Yousaf's backbone in making the decision that he's made today.
Just briefly, because again, to reiterate, we asked the SNP for a Scottish Government minister, but no one was available. Kate, you wanted to say something?
I think there's an important lesson here for every political party going into a general election. Don't make promises that you can't keep. Don't make the kinds of commitments that sound fantastic, they sound progressive, they sound ambitious. If they're not achievable, and you're not going to be able to deliver them. And even there you had your Green MSP saying, we're not actually able to deliver this. It's never the message you want to be having to give.
Yeah, it just erodes trust in politics generally.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about a different promise from a different party and talk about the railways and Labour's plan to nationalise UK railways, as the front page there of the Eye has splashed across. The front page, The Guardian, has a very similar headline. Labour pledges to nationalise rail network within 5 years, and again reiterated and echoed by the Mirror. Election promise. Labour will nationalise rail in 5 years. Well, this morning, Labour Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, Louise Haigh, was asked on BBC Breakfast about whether fares would be cheaper.
Guarantee that we'll lower fares, but what we are saying is that we'll simplify them. Passengers have to contend with a dizzying array of different types of fares and ticket structures, and what we are saying is that we will have an ambition for a best fare guarantee. So just as when people travel in London and they tap in and tap out of the system, they have confidence that they're getting the lowest possible fare for that journey. At the moment, they don't have that confidence in the train system because it is so complex, and quite frankly, people often feel that they're being fleeced.
I think we can also hear from the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, who has responded. Let's have a listen.
It's an unfunded plan that they've got. They've got no idea how to pay for it. And also, the other thing I think, there's nothing in it that's going to improve services for passengers. The other thing that people need to understand is what the damage that will be done by Angela Rayner's plan to reverse all our trade union legislation. You're going to go back to French-style wildcat strikes with no notice. One of the things that's contributing to the unreliability of service on the railways are the strikes that are being called. There's a fair pay offer on the table for ASLEF. They should put it to their members. It's not surprising the unions have welcomed Labour's plans, puts them back in the driving seat.
Mark Harper then. Well, let's start with the plan. Sam Terry, what difference will it make?
I think it'll make a massive difference. You know, look, there's been a consensus in the industry for many, many years that essentially how we run our railways in a different way to almost every other European country is a total joke.
So why can't Louise Haigh say that fares will be cheaper? That's what passengers really want to know.
Look, I've not got all of the details of all of those figures, but my guess would be, having been a former Shadow Transport Minister and having worked in the rail industry, that the key thing that you're going to do is you're not going to have to pay the profits of train operating companies. During the pandemic, the British taxpayer, to the tune of billions of pounds, bailed out those companies. Many of those companies have been inefficient, they've collapsed. Actually, the ones that are now publicly being run currently by a Conservative government are already finding that in some of those companies they're able to put in better working practices. They're starting to move towards actually some better agreements with some of the unions. Yeah. There's money to be saved. And in fact, the Williams review, which is, by the way, Keith Williams today welcomed this report commissioned by the Conservatives, has said 1.5 billion minimum would be saved through bringing different parts of the railway together to work more collegiately. We call it fragmentation in the industry. It would end that, and it would be a much more strategic way of running the railways.
Do you accept, unless ticket prices come down, it won't be deemed a success, however effective the plan is on paper?
I think actually in the end ticket prices will be likely to be rising less under this mechanism because you're not having no, but hold on, obviously there is always going to be inflation, but you're not funding profits. The next stage beyond this, by the way, because obviously they have said there's an ambition for a fares guarantee, I think that's excellent. At the moment, about 55 different types of ticket you can get. You shouldn't be able to turn up at Euston Station to go up to Crewe and have to pay 200 quid to get on a train. That is madness. That is going to end under this plan.
Right. The madness is going to end.
I think what you're seeing here is a foreshadowing, if Labour are lucky enough to get into government, of the unions being back in charge of policy on issues like this. This is driven by a union mentality that any involvement with the private sector in our railways is a no-go area. I think to really reflect on this issue properly, you have to cast your mind back to a time that I didn't directly experience, but older people will have done, of what was it like when the government ran the railways. And that's the kind of core question here. Do you believe that the government is the best placed people to go about growing passenger numbers and running railways? And I happen to think that government should focus on things as much as possible only they can do, where they can make a really big impact. Of course, this government is not ideological. Mark is a very sensible Transport Secretary. When it's been sensible, he's brought some railway operators back into public use. But if anyone thinks that a publicly run with a union-backed government, which we would have if Labour win, is going to improve our railways, does anyone right now think that the best thing we could do is make it even easier for people to strike?
I'm not the shadow
strike.
Well,
we'll come on to strike.
Right now, under Labour government, there will be less strikes.
Because
we know that the reason they've not settled with ASLEF, the same reason the government have not settled with the doctors, is to have the political fight. It's not actually about getting the best deal for British taxpayers and for fare-paying passengers. Right. That's the truth of it. If Labour were in power, we wouldn't be having these strikes.
Is that because you would meet their demands,
exactly.
the train drivers'
Not necessarily meet their demands, but we'd actually sit round the table. No, but come on, everyone has seen, and we've seen Hugh Merriman, put plans out that hadn't even been put on the table to be discussed by the
You won't put the current offer to the members. You won't, sorry, apologies. ASLEF, they won't even let the membership vote on the offer. And if people think that a roughly £5,000 pay rise for people who are on 60 grand for a 4-day week is not a fair offer, I don't think that's really in touch with what the British public think is reasonable. And more importantly, what they want, if I can just finish, is changes in working practices. Right now, in some of the railway operators, you can get as little of notice as a train driver telling you at 10 p.m. the day before, you're going on holiday tomorrow and you won't be in.
The entire railway system run on overtime.
They won't back down on those issues, and they have to.
We don't train enough drivers,
so
we don't have enough staff.
You wouldn't want to see that stop, that practice?
I would want to see, proper discussions and negotiations. Most of the rail unions are actually an intrinsic part of how our railways operate. And, actually, if some of their suggestions were listened to, we would have more efficient railways.
Do you think it's reasonable for any operator of a train company to have a driver call up, as long as it's before 10 p.m. the day before, and say, I'm not coming, I'm on annual leave? Do you think that's a reasonable working practice?
I don't know about the specifics of what's gone on in different train operating companies, because there are obviously a lot of agreements about working practice in a lot of different train operating companies. But I would say this, OK, this will deliver a more efficient, effective, modern railway system. There's not just a guarantee about fares. This has also got to go on to tackle some of the more difficult issues. The viewers here won't know, for example, the rolling stock companies, which Labour is not committing to changing this, but I think could be a future ambition. We, as taxpayers, pay to the tune of every year billions and billions and billions of pounds to lease every single train back. That is crazy. So we're actually leasing things back from other governments that are state-owned rail operators across the world. I mean, this is just, the most mad system, and it's got to end. And you know what? The polling says, whether it's a UKIP voter, a Tory voter, a Liberal voter, a Labour voter, everyone supports this because it makes common sense. Distant memories of what
it was like when the government was doing it, I think, is the issue.
No, well, that's actually a myth, Kieran. British Rail actually was a hugely innovative force. It was actually the breakup of British Rail under the Conservative government that created a total disaster. Network South East was one of the biggest
passenger numbers.
I'm going to bring it.
Doubling in passenger numbers, more than doubling in passenger numbers.
Can you really sit there, though, Kieran, and say that rail privatisation has been a success?
I think, as I said, you have to compare what was it like before, and my understanding is it wasn't run well by the government, and have a look at what actually over the trend in time, passenger numbers have more than doubled. And every time you grow passenger numbers, you're reducing the subsidy from the taxpayer.
I'll just give you one very quick example, OK? One very quick example, OK? Advanced passenger technology, designed British Rail, so that's now what they use on Pendolino trains. British Rail designed that, British engineers, the height of British industry in the 80s and 90s. We then sold it to the Italians, and the Tory government had to then buy it back, and that's now what we run, that technology. That is a madness of the system the Tories brought in.
Lib Dems, Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, has committed to a cut in fares. How can he commit to that?
Because we'll have a fully costed manifesto that looks at it. But look, you know, I think where we can all agree is we want better rail services. We want better rail services for consumers, and we also want better rail services because we want to get people out of their cars and see that they have reliable services. And what we've seen under this Conservative government, Kieran's sort of challenging Sam there in relation to working practices, there's no sign of the government doing anything to get those striking rail people around the table to actually work out what are the best ways of doing things. But what we've seen under the Conservatives is a situation where our services continue to decline and customers are having to pay more for that. And that absolutely needs to change. And I think the first benefit that customers need to see is a reduction in freeze in fares so that they can make the proper choice to take the train rather than something else. And from a strategic perspective generally, you know, I think I agree with you that we have seen failings in the privatisation of the system. ScotRail now nationalised, LNER that I use every week now under an operator of last resort. It's quite clear the current system isn't working.
Yeah, but the diagnosis of the current system is one thing. But how would the sorts of things that you're talking about be delivered?
Well, I think what Labour are proposing is interesting, but, you know, as Liberal Democrats, what we are not saying is that we want to look at a nationalised model. I think all three parties are potentially agreeing about the name of that strategic oversight that we need to see in terms of Great British Railways that looks and focuses on customers first and moves forward from there.
A lot of people will just say privatisation's failed. You know, the railways are a mess. They're unreliable, so many of the trains that are running, and the fares are expensive. Surely it's time to try something else.
It's going to be a popular policy, but it's not a plan. There's nothing that Labour has announced today that is actually going to achieve what it says it wants to. It's great to say we will be more efficient, we will hit our targets, that, you know, hopefully rail fares will go down. It's great to say it. What they've announced are some additional quangos, which are apparently going to watch each other. They're adding layers and layers of bureaucracy on top of this. Yeah. If you are paying less for something, someone else is paying more. Someone else is subsidising it. And I think that when you get into the nitty-gritties of who's actually going to bring down rail fares, subsidise those rail fares, i.e. the taxpayer, a lot of people will think, well, they would like the rail system to run better, they'd like it to be cheaper. It is unfair that somebody who's often earning less would be subsidising middle-class people going to work. It's a totally unreasonable thing to do. And on that point about money, if you are going to renationalise the railways, you are going to lose a lot of private business investment. This is an expensive policy.
OK, that's just nonsense. That's just not even true. Most of the investment into the railways has been public investment. When you're bringing the contracts in as they end, there is no cost. You're not buying out of the contracts. And I'll give you an example of how crazy things are at the moment. You have what's called delay attributors. There's hundreds and hundreds of them. They argue between the train operating companies and Network Rail who is responsible to pay the fine, because whose fault was it, Network Rail or was it the train operating company? That in itself just wastes millions and millions of pounds.
I completely agree that the system of privatised railways, a public network, has been abysmal.
Steel and wheel together.
Don't talk over each other, but go on, finish your point, Sam.
It's the integration that saves the money. If you bring Network Rail and the train operators more closely together, which actually there is some agreement in kind of this guiding mind idea, that is where the multi-billion-pound year-on-year savings are. There is no other rail system anywhere in the world, from Japan to Europe, where they don't have an integration between what's called wheel and steel. We've separated it out and it's been a disaster, and this is going to end that.
I agree separating out has been a problem, but if you look at...
Well, so you do agree with the idea of bringing...
I think Labour would go in one direction and I would probably go in the other, right? I think we can all agree the mixed system hasn't worked out so well. If you look at the bulk of rail investment, you're right, it does come from the government, but that's primarily because of HS2. And that was a lie we were all sold, right? The idea you're going to get loads of private investment into HS2. No, it didn't happen, didn't work. That has been a grandstanding disaster. But you are going to have a big black hole when it comes to trying to fill that private sector investment. I'm not saying it's impossible to fill it. I'm saying it's a cost. And you've got the Prime Minister committing to 2.5% defence spending by 2030. You've got people calling for more money for the NHS. You've got people calling for more money for education. We've seen this a lot recently with water, with rail.
Well,
when something isn't working, people say, well, if you bring it into state hands, we care about it, so politicians will care about it. But you know what happens when you go into an election? It's more money for the NHS. It's more money for the triple lock-on state pensions.
Well, the water companies, they were bought by hedge funds, strapped up for billions of pounds of debt, and then we were told as taxpayers to pay it out. Where's the investment?
The problems that arise in these utilities, whatever they might be, are because of private ownership. Look at Welsh Water. We're talking about the water companies.
But isn't it because of private ownership?
Welsh Water is a not-for-profit in Wales, and they have
so
worse
you think it's okay
records.
for Southern Water and the other companies to put up prices
They have a worse
40%.
They have a worse record. So Welsh Water are not for profit, and they have a worse record on these issues than the privatised companies.
But does
so it's
that
just
mean?
not
But
true
does
to say that the model of ownership dictates on its own whether a service is better or worse.
What the British
I accept
public
that the
GBR,
the Great British Railway plan,
taxpayers subsidising profits
the Great British Railway,
billions of pounds a bit, and then having the prices put
Yeah, but
up.
the Great British Railway is the idea that you bring together more effectively the controlling mind. I think we probably all agree that at the very least needs to happen. But the idea that the government and bureaucrats are better at running a railway than a company that's set up to do it with people who are driven to do it, who've got a profit motive to do it. And actually, in the scheme of things, comparatively, a relatively small profit motive. Pre-pandemic, it was something like 2 pence in the pound of the cost of your ticket went to the railway providers. The costs that the taxpayer puts in massively outweigh that. So, you know, if people honestly think that just by making the government run it, it will suddenly be better. It's naive, and our most recent experience of that is that it's just not true.
Let's have answer this, and then I want you to also answer
it's
about how big a priority.
There's not going to be some fat controller sitting in Whitehall pulling the sort of levers in this. That is just not going to happen. This is about driving efficiencies in the sector. You've got a huge publicly owned company called Network Rail that do all of the infrastructure, all the renewals, all the long-term investment. That does not work in sync with the train operating companies. On top of that, you have the rolling stock, all owned either by hedge funds called Roscoe's. The whole thing at every stage is inefficient and rips off the taxpayer. Labour are basically saying we're going to make this more efficient and end that. And in the end, Kate, it will save money.
Well,
no doubt about
there's
it.
no plan to do it. And
well,
I think you're being very.
Actually, I disagree.
I think you're being very misleading to the taxpayer.
Lays it out.
I think you're being very misleading to the taxpayer by suggesting that the government's going to prioritise investment in areas like rail and water.
Right. Well, let's do that. I mean, in terms of it being a priority. And in terms of the other priorities, like defence, most recently, as mentioned by Kate, do you think and do you have faith that a Labour government would prioritise the railways?
I have faith that we have a long-term industrial strategy, and this is part of it. You know, I was speaking at a debate the other day on rail manufacturing. This is tied in with this, OK? Because unless we're investing into the railways, unless we're creating jobs, long-term jobs, we're not going to grow the economy. We're not going to actually, boost, tertiary intake.
Where is that money coming from? I mean, Rachel Reeves has committed to Jeremy Hunt's fiscal rules. There isn't a lot of money to play with right now. And I just think it's very misleading to suggest, don't worry, the government will take care of it. It's the private sector that doesn't care. The government will take care of it.
Because of how it's run.
When
I wish
you
we could
actually
claw back the money.
I'd
rather we clawed back the money from some of the train operating companies that we bailed them out with during the pandemic. I mean, we have literally put so much money into the railways that, you know, if you look at the profits that have made by all of the major train operating companies, they are still astronomical. Not as bad as in the water companies, I admit, where dividends have been paid out because their companies were strapped up with so much debt just to play dividends.
Labour isn't claiming it's
But the public have ran out of
faith
faith in the idea that privatisation is a success. In water, it's not a success. In parts of electricity, it's not a success. It's not a success in the national grid, and it's certainly not a success in railways. And this will happen, and we will be in 30 years' time probably with more public ownership.
Well, would you like Keir Starmer? Would you like Keir Starmer to go further? I mean, are you disappointed that he hasn't stuck to his original pledge?
I think this is a sensible...
let's just remind people of what he said, because it is along the lines you've been talking about. It was one of his 10 pledges that public services should be in public hands. This was when he stood to be leader, clearly won. Not making profits for shareholders, support common ownership of rail, mail, energy and water, end outsourcing in our NHS, local government and justice system. Now, that has been dropped. Yes. Are you disappointed?
I think on this rail stuff, no, not at all. I think it's a sensible plan. I think it's achievable. I think Louise can absolutely deliver it in the next 5 years.
And mail, energy and water?
Well, look, I mean, you know, we have a big debate in Labour Party. He's chosen the pathway he is, and we're way ahead in the polls. Does that mean that I agree with every aspect of it? Perhaps not. But I do think, as a model, public ownership can clearly deliver efficiencies. I think it's a myth that it's only the private sector that can do that. And I think that actually, and it will be demonstrated in rail, it will be a far better system. We cannot have a system where our railways are run by the state operators of various other European nations. So you think it's fine for us to give taxpayers money in this country to Germany, to France, to Italy. My local train that I got in today, you know, from East London, run by Trenitalia. This is crazy. British taxpayers think this is unacceptable. That money should be spent here, not going abroad to foreign companies' profits.
Take a much larger share of taxpayers' money in those countries. And so, again, as Kate said, you have to be realistic with people. If you're saying that you don't want the private sector involved, that means an even bigger bill for the...
private sector won't be involved, they won't be involved in running trains.
Yes, well, at the moment they are. and they contribute their economy to that, their efforts, and they get a small profit from it. If you're going to say we're not going to allow that anymore, then you're then transferring a greater burden on the taxpayer, one, financially. Two, you're then saying that the government and civil servants are better at running railways than train operating companies. I think most of the British public have a healthy scepticism about the ability of civil servants to do things. So I always find it bizarre that we spend the whole time criticising what the government does deliver, but then want the government to do even more. And ultimately, as I said, if you've got a situation where you unfortunately might have a Labour government, I hope we don't, but if we do, I'm afraid they're going to be beholden to the unions on these, as I said, bizarre working practices that make the whole thing even more difficult.
Hang on. I just want to...
industrial disputes running.
Right, well, on industrial...
Let's look in London. TfL. Khan said, vote me in, there'll be no strikes under me, I'm Labour, I'll work with the unions. Actually, he's had loads of strikes and then caved in the end, ultimately, with huge pay rises that were not
We've had 22
suitable.
months, the longest industrial dispute since the 1970s. And the only reason it's not been settled with ASLEF and the RMT is simply because the government wanted the political fight for electoral gain.
Right.
There's no other reason.
I've got one more question. Kieran, I've got one more question to ask, because what was the point of bringing in minimum service level legislation? What was the point of that? We spent hours talking about it when no train operator is currently willing to use it.
Can I say on that quickly? Border force.
Hang on, I was asking him first, and then I'll come to you.
But the government itself has not even issued MSL.
All right.
On border force.
It was a waste of time.
No, it wasn't a waste of time. It was about putting a mechanism in place to be available to people if they felt it was appropriate to be used. If the train operating companies don't happen to think it's appropriate in these circumstances, that's a decision for them. There's very little point in having an arrangement where we let train operating companies make some decisions and then overrule them. So I think it's there to be used in future circumstances, and it's actually, of course, not just applicable to the railways. Things like the NHS, very important in the
legislation
NHS.
Ignored?
Not
Having
ignored.
argued about
the legislation.
getting it passed.
No, it's not ignored. The legislation was to put in place powers that were to be available to people, not to dictate that they have to use them.
Are you telling me that Mark
Harper
Harper isn't speaking to the train companies and asking why they're not implementing it?
Well, he may well be, but as I said, what I'm saying is, there was a point of bringing it in to make it available. If they don't choose to use it, that's up to them.
Before we move on, your position within the Labour Party and in terms of standing as a candidate, because you were deselected at one point. What's happening?
Look, there's a lot of controversy around that. Sometimes in politics, it's your own side that you have to watch out for. But I've been very clear to the Labour Party that what went on was totally unacceptable, and that we don't want to have a public fight about the evidence I've got that shows that was completely rigged. So we are going to come to an agreement. I will be a Labour candidate at the next election, no doubt in my mind about that. All
right, and this is breaking news. Obviously, going back to our story at the beginning of the programme, which is that the power sharing deal between the SNP and the Greens is over. Well, now this BBC News headline, Ross, that's Douglas Ross, leader of the Conservatives in Scotland, to lodge a vote of no confidence in Humza Yousaf, and that's in the SNP First Minister. We'll bring you any more developments on that. But let's move on, because you also heard in the headlines and saw a head teacher who's introduced an option for a 12-hour day at his school. Andrew O'Neill, the head of All Saints Catholic College in West London, is with us now. Why?
There's a myriad of different reasons why, Jo. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Really, it's looking at the situation that we face ourselves in education in 2024. It's been a really, really challenging couple of years running schools. This has been widely debated across the education sector, but we're seeing issues around attendance to schools, we're seeing issues around engagement, and we're trying to reverse some of those patterns and actually offer something completely different and realistically offer something that so many parents clamour for, to send their children to a private school and pay through the nose for. And we're trying to do that in the state system. Right.
What is it you're offering then outside of the sort of traditional school day?
Yeah, so we've got an earlier breakfast club offer for students. So it's a 10-week pilot for children in year 7 and 8. So they can come in early for a breakfast at 7:15 if they wish to. They don't have to attend for that. Then they've got a normal school day. And then at the end of the school day, we are ensuring that across Monday to Thursday, they get all of their homework done. They have additional one-to-one tuition or small group tutoring with members of staff. And most of those members of staff are being brought in externally. And then they get to do a range of different activities after that, including playing sports together, various different games. We've got drama clubs, we've got cooking, we've got some oracy sessions that we're doing with them. And then they end with a meal together, and they eat a meal with each other and with some members of staff. mainly senior staff at that point, and then they go off home, hopefully
Right.
buzzing from having what is a wonderful day.
Are they tired?
Well, you wouldn't think it when you see them yesterday and the last couple of days. They're absolutely loving it, and the feedback we get from the children and from the parents is that it's brilliant. You know, lots of parents the last couple of days have said, you know, we're not having to chase them for their homework, and they're coming home excited, talking, you know, about how fantastic their school day has been.
Right, a good idea. Wendy, a 12-hour day for pupils with all those extracurricular activities on offer?
Well, you know, as a working parent as I was while my children were at school, I needed both breakfast and after-school clubs and was, you know, content to pay for them for that purpose. And, you know, it was very useful for me as a parent, but my children got a lot of benefit from it as well. And so I can see that there are benefits here. I think what we're looking at is post-COVID, we do know that we're seeing increased absences for young people and disengagement from school. So if this is a way of looking at it, my question would be, I suppose, is obviously it's a 10-week pilot, but going forward, if there was strong support for it, how would it be funded? You know, often when I think about other after-school activities that my children took up, it was down to the goodwill and commitment of teachers volunteering in their own time to make that happen. If we are seeing successes from such pilots, it's then over to how do we best assure and facilitate those things to go forward. But it certainly sounds like you're off to a great start, and thanks very much for telling about it.
Kate, what do you make of it? I mean, is there a sort of implicit judgment that perhaps pupils are better served staying in school than going home, maybe if parents aren't there or they're working and so on?
Oh, I think it's fantastic. I think it's a great opportunity. There were a lot of consequences to the draconian lockdowns that we had, and I think at the top of that list is what happened to school children and how many hours, how many days and weeks in some cases of education that they missed. So any attempt to catch them up is absolutely fantastic. But if there were, you know, if we were to talk about the legacy of a Tory government, I don't know why we'd be talking about legacies looking in the past, but if we were, it would be the education reforms. That would be at the top of the list, right, of achievements. And the idea behind that was not just to offer more choice, it was to level up the state sector. And I think that's exactly what you're seeing here. It's a wonderful opportunity for kids.
Right, well, let's just have a look at this BBC News headline, and please stay with us, Andrew, or bear with me, I should say. South Cambridgeshire Council keeps 4-day week amid government threat. So as we're talking about 12-hour days possibly being a great thing for pupils, there may be pupils thinking, why are you supporting the idea of shortening the working week for adults and parents?
Well, that's obviously about 4-day working week is about doing the same amount of hours across a whole week. So you're actually talking about those longer days in terms of productivity and giving people the opportunity to think about different ways of working. We've just talked here about the legacy of COVID in relation to children and young people, and I agree, you know, that the consequences of that have been profound. But also I think we do have to acknowledge that some of our ways of working as adults in working life have changed too.
Right, but I assume...
And Cambridge clearly think that it's continued to be worth pursuing. I think, you know, this for me is a little bit of why are the government so determined to make an example of Cambridge? Do we have an election coming?
Well, first of all, to say to Andrew, you know, the whole point of the Academies programme was to allow good day teachers who want to innovate and do things differently to do that, and that's why I think the programme as a whole has been very successful, and it seems like this is another example of someone trying something different, and I'm sure Andrew, if it's successful, will be keen to share that and let other schools follow suit. And I think it does replicate for some people who perhaps parents aren't in a position for various reasons to create that kind of richer curriculum of life outside of school hours, to do that within the school structure, and I think that's a very positive thing. But of course, freedom has to be balanced with the harsh realities of day-to-day life, and I think the idea that you would kind of put a burden onto parents that they don't have their children in school on a Friday is just, seems to me bizarre. I don't know how well I'm not familiar with how well that's been received locally and whether it's been forced on parents, but there has to be a balance between freedom and actually the government setting a national framework through which everybody works and can rely on, because actually the employers are often national employers with national terms and conditions, and you can't expect parents in one part of the country to have a completely different working arrangement when it comes to schools.
Well, I think we'll find that the school holidays in Scotland start at the end of June, but I won't finish till the end of July in terms of schools, and plenty of local authorities have Friday finishes as well. So I don't think that is the right argument that we should be having here.
But that's a bit, of course, it's not everything exactly the same, but I think something like the school day that you can expect your children to go to as a minimum, I think is a pretty kind of basic expectation that most parents would have, even if they're used to slightly different holiday dates in their area, which they get used to and accommodate.
Sam, do you welcome what Andrew's trying to do with the school?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. My kids, sometimes go to breakfast clubs, after school clubs. I mean, 12 hours sounds massive, but actually if you think it's sort of 7 till 6, it's not actually that massive, and perhaps allows parents to get home from, work, if you finish at 5, without having to then pay for additional wraparound care. So it might even save some parents money. I mean, look, on the 4-day week thing, broadly I support that. I think that actually there's a lot of evidence to say that people are more productive if they're given a longer weekend, but more time to work intensely and focused than actually just, having an extra day on a Friday. And actually the TUC has got that as an ambition, I think, over the next sort of 20 to 50 years.
I mean, Andrew, to come back to the issue of cost, it was raised by Wendy, one of our guests on the panel. I mean, the cost to pupils for these extracurricular activities, it's open to all pupils, but are there some who won't be able to take it up?
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose I've got 2 points. I want to come back on something that was just said there. But, I mean, we've budgeted for this and we planned for this over a very long period of time to make it work. And as I said, it's a pilot for a group of children in year 7 and 8. We're charging parents £10 a week. So, I mean, it's almost a tokenistic charge. And the funding of that is quite big from our end. But just to go back, I suppose, to Kate's point, around education being a success story, I'd kind of challenge that a little bit, particularly post-pandemic. I think the reason that we are having to do this is because of the fact that education really hasn't been at the top of the government's agenda for some years now. And there isn't the support, there aren't the ideas, there aren't the policies. The schools bill was binned off in 2022. And it's, I'm doing this because I'm taking pragmatic steps within my own school community to do something different and innovative, because I'm seeing that the challenges that families are facing and that children are facing. And I think that there needs to be a wider look at this.
Can I just come in on that? I think it's kind of, with all due respect to Andrew, it's kind of ironic that he's making use of important reforms the government made to do something really positive and then saying, the government hasn't done enough on education. The very reason he can make those choices is because of how we've changed things like pupil premium funding to let schools innovate and choose how they want to spend it and how they want to operate things. And actually the evidence when it comes to, for example, educational attainment is a huge improvement since we've been in government, and actually the number of schools that are good are outstanding.
And post-pandemic,
and of course, post-pandemic then,
and the situation of having closed schools.
The pandemic came in and then obviously made things very difficult, and some of the very positive trends that we had seen have stalled in some respects. But I think everybody understands that the government can't magically undo a period of people not being in school, and it's going to take some time.
Well,
I think
undo's one thing, but Andrew, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to get your head out the sand and speak to school leaders, because I think if we look at, we've got 9 million children in the school system. We have an attendance crisis where 10% of those children in secondary schools, they're not in every day. We've got children who are going to schools that are crumbling, and we've seen that in the news. We've got nearly every local authority in the country who have a crisis in their SEN funding, including my own. So the funding that goes to the most vulnerable children that we've got. And we've got mental health referrals through the roof to social services, not only in my borough, but in all
right. Well, Andrew, let Kieran respond.
Changes and challenges come in. Have a philosophical disagreement about whether, for example, a huge change in the mental health of children post-pandemic is in purely a government thing to fix, or whether attendance at school, again, is purely a government thing to fix.
It's a big issue, isn't it, Kieran?
Yes, absolutely, and government has a really important role in all of these things, but also do parents, so does society. We all have a role to play in tackling these social issues that affect all of us and are not directly and only the fault of the government.
All right, let me just briefly, Andrew, because we're coming up to the end of the programme, this BBC News headline, one word, Ofsted grades should stay, says the government. I mean, there's been an awful lot of consultation about this, and it obviously follows the tragic taking of her life. Ruth Perry, she was a head teacher of Caversham Primary School, and her school was downgraded. Do you agree with the government keeping those one-word judgments?
If I'm honest, I mean, my school's an outstanding school. So, we have a one-word judgment that's great benefit to us. But if I'm honest, I think they need to go. I think the government have been completely and utterly tone deaf on this. It's been called for to be got rid of by teachers, unions, the Education Select Committee.
Yes,
I don't understand why they've done that. It's a very, very blunt device.
All right, Andrew, I'm going to have to stop you there because we're almost at the end. You've got a few seconds.
I mean, I think I'm open to the idea that if the government's counter proposals don't work, that we look at it again. But there is always a tension between what is easy for the public to understand and parents to understand, and what school leaders will want to. Well, you know, everyday people at school use those words. They'll say their local school.
I'll let them chat on, but that's all we've got time for. From all of us here, bye-bye.